undisputed, most diabolical fantasy villains in the world, Fantasy Brains!
What is up, Brainiacs? Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Brains podcast, and I'm so excited to bring you episode 9 of the 32-team series. If you have not been with us for episodes 1 through 8 of this series, the 32-team series is a series where I am analyzing all 32 NFL offenses from a fantasy football perspective. If you look to my right, we have the fantasy football whiteboard right here. We're going to be looking at things like the depth chart changes from last year to this year, the fantasy football forecast, which includes projecting every single player who is fantasy relevant on this offense and where they are going to finish on the season compared to where they're being drafted. We're going to be looking at their strength of schedule by position group, as well as their week 15, 16, 17 schedule, also known as their fantasy playoff schedule. And then we're going to be looking at some sexy storylines, just some interesting stuff that could change the course of the season if it goes one way or the other. Now, before we get to the meat of this video, make sure to follow us on all of our social media accounts at Leatherbrains. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter, on TikTok for a ton of daily fantasy advice. And then you can also go over to our YouTube and hit that subscribe button. You can find the rest of our 32 team series episodes on there, as well as all the other content that we do post. And then we have the audio version of our podcast on Spotify. So definitely go check it out and give us a follow on all of those platforms. But like I said, this is going to be episode 9, and we are going to be starting out with the AFC South today. So we started the first two. We started out with the NFC North, and we started out with, the AFC North. So we did both North divisions, and now we are getting to the AFC South. So this is, in my opinion, probably the worst division in the NFL. You could argue maybe it's the NFC South, which we'll get to next, but I think the AFC South is definitely up there for one of the worst divisions. And we're going to start out today with potentially the worst team in that division with the Indianapolis Colts. So let's start out here. When we're looking at the quarterback position, I mean, this is just a bloodbath of a quarterback room. You go from last year with a combination of Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco, where AR played a handful of games. He got injured a few times and didn't play for the rest of the season. And then you have, 38-year-old Joe Flacco coming in, slinging the rock as he always does. Now Flacco leaves, insert Daniel Jones, and he comes in as the quarterback of this team. Played for 4 to 6 years with the Giants, and we all know what Daniel Jones is. He's not a great quarterback. However, he is very different than Anthony Richardson. And I think that's the important thing to think about with this quarterback room, is how polar opposite these two guys are. You have Anthony Richardson, who is not consistent at all. He has the high rushing floor. He's going to be tossing deep balls down the field, but he's also going to be throwing a lot of picks, not going to be completing a lot of passes. The offense is going to look very different under him, whereas Daniel Jones is going to be the more consistent option, going to be completing a lot of passes over the middle of the field. He'll also run, but not at the same rate that Anthony Richardson would. So as you'll notice throughout this video, I'm going to be talking a lot about is really going to depend who's going to be the starter of this team. And that's going to affect all the other options on this offense. And most likely, if Daniel Jones is the starter, that's going to pretty much increase the value of every other player on this offense. So looking at the running back room, we have Jonathan Taylor, who I'm very high on this season. Jonathan Taylor is a stud of a player. He's been great every single year. He's actually the current active leader in rush yards per game, even over guys like Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. In his career, he averages over 80 yards rushing per game. Very safe player when it comes to the workload he's going to get. They did draft DJ Giddens in round 5 this year of the NFL draft out of Kansas State University. However, Jonathan Taylor is one of those guys in fantasy where you can lock him in for about an 80% snap share, which is going to rank top 5 in the NFL out of all running backs, coming off a season last year where he had 1,600 total yards, 20 catches, and 12 touchdowns on the season. Now, a lot of people said last year was a disappointing season for him because a lot of his production did come in those last 3 weeks of the season. But if you were like me, you got lucky, and my team still made it to the playoffs despite some of those woes in the early season for Taylor, and then he was able to really carry me through those fantasy playoffs. So I think with JT, you're talking about a very talented player, a player that the offense is going to run through, and he's playing in a contract year. Even though he has this year and next year on his contract, they do have an opt-out after this year, so it is a big year for him where he could be looking for another extension if he has a great season. Now, looking at the receiver room, it's going to be the same as last year. And similar to the Green Bay Packers, a team that we looked at, about a week ago, it's just a room that I really just don't want any part in. And I think with the value with these receivers, if Daniel Jones is the starter in this offense, I think some of these receivers have value. If Anthony Richardson is the starter, I would really stay away from all of these guys. So you're looking at Michael Pittman Jr. being the top guy in this offense. He's coming off his worst season with 69 catches, a little bit over 800 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Now, I will say Michael Pittman Jr. in 2022 and 2023 was a top 25 receiver. So he definitely has shown that upside to be a good fantasy option. But last year, he really catapulted down to planet Earth there, and he was not great. And so I think a lot of people are expecting him to have somewhat of a similar season that he had last year. Then you have Josh Downs, who is the young ascending player coming into his third year now. He's going to be working mostly out of the slot. He had 72 catches for a little bit over 800 yards and 5 touchdowns. Very consistent option. I was actually very high on him until they drafted Tyler Warren, because now I think Tyler Warren could come in and take a lot of that production over the middle of the field. But Downs is a consistent player. He's a very good route runner, very elusive after the catch. So I think if there's a receiver that I like the most in this offense with a high floor on a week-to-week basis, I think Josh Downs is your guy. Then you have Alec Pierce, who for some reason I just found out that he led the team in receiving yards last year with 824 yards and 7 touchdowns on only 37 catches, averaging over 22 yards per catch. Those numbers are absolutely ridiculous. And if he repeats that, I don't really know what I would say, considering I have him projected for a lot less this season. But Alec Pierce did prove that he can be a really good deep ball machine. And if Anthony Richardson is the starter, I think he is the one player to really benefit from that with the deep ball that Anthony Richardson can throw. And then you have A.D. Mitchell, second round pick from last year, who didn't really do much last year. He had 23 catches for 312 yards and 0 touchdowns. But his advanced metrics were not too bad. He did get open on a semi-consistent basis, but the quarterback play was terrible and he got missed often. Looking at the tight end room, Tyler Warren comes in, gets drafted 14th overall. I think Tyler Warren is a terrific NFL prospect. Comes in from Penn State in his senior year, goes for 104 catches, 1,200 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And that's not including any of the statistics he put up as a running back or as a quarterback in that offense. So he's kind of a do-it-all player where you can get him the ball in many different ways. And he's going to be, in my opinion, the best receiving option on this team. So I'm really excited to see what he can do. And then looking at the O-line, they did lose their center, left guard, and right guard. So it is going to be a different O-line than last year. And considering they were pretty mediocre last year, it could mean that the O-line could deteriorate even more from what it was last season. But let's look at the fantasy football forecast, which is what you are all waiting for. So looking at this Colts team, I have them passing for about 3,200 yards and 17 touchdowns with about 297 completions. So when I look at this team, it's just so hard to predict who is going to be the starting quarterback. And I think both guys are going to get a run at some point this season because I don't think this team is very good. I think the Colts are going to finish last in the division. They don't have a great defense. They don't have a great O-line. Other than Jonathan Taylor and Tyler Warren, I don't think any of their weapons on offense are game-changing. So I think that you're going to see pretty much a 50-50 split on the season between Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones. So combined, I got them going for about 3,200 yards and 17 touchdowns. And like I said, about 300 completions. Now, when it comes to drafting both of these players, I would stay away from both Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones in your regular redraft leagues. Now, if you're in best ball, I don't mind going with an Anthony Richardson because if he is the starter, he obviously has rushing upside where he can go out in a game and play like dog shit and throw for 150 yards and 2 picks. But he could also give you 85 rush yards and 2 touchdowns, which makes him a great fantasy quarterback on the week. So I think in best ball formats, Anthony Richardson definitely has some value and can give you some spike weeks down the line. So he's a very interesting player, but those guys are both in my ADP rankings. I have Anthony Richardson as my quarterback 29. That's exactly where he's going. And then I got Daniel Jones as my quarterback 34, which again is exactly where he's going. And when we look at the rest of the options on this team, you are really, truly hoping that Daniel Jones can be the starter in this offense because Anthony Richardson is a player like Justin Fields where he's going to take away all the value from the pass catchers and even from Jonathan Taylor when it comes to the goal line carries that Anthony Richardson could potentially steal. So let's look at some of the receiver upside or the receiver values here. I got Michael Pittman Jr. not having a pretty poor year. I have him going as my wide receiver 61, whereas he's being drafted as the receiver 48. No, I agree. I think there is upside for him to bounce back. Like I mentioned earlier, he was a wide receiver 2 in 2022 and 2023, but the passing volume in this offense is just so awful that I just can't bet on him to be a good player. Again, in best ball leagues, I think there's value there because he could have some really good weeks. But I think it's going to be really hard to predict when he's going to be good in your regular redraft leagues and when to actually submit him in that starting lineup. So I have Pittman going for about 62 catches, 620 yards, and 4 touchdowns on the season. So I have him having a really mediocre year. And I think part of the reason with that is, like I mentioned earlier, you have Josh Downs, who's going to be playing out of the slot. And then you have Alec Pierce, who led the team in receiving last year, and Adonai Mitchell, who's coming into year 2. So you have 2 open spots on the outside for 3 guys. I think those 3 guys are going to likely split a lot of time together. And so I think while Pittman is a really good blocker and will likely stay on the field, he could only have, a 70% snap share as opposed to a 90% snap share because there's other guys they want to get involved. Looking at the next receiver, we got Josh Downs. I have him as my receiver 48, going as the receiver 47. Now, he is a good player. I will say that he is a good player, and I do believe in him as a slot receiver in order to catch a lot of passes, which in PPR leagues is always going to turn into a lot of points. However, the draft pick of Tyler Warren does not help him. And on top of that, if Anthony Richardson is a starter, I don't think he's a startable option. If Daniel Jones comes out and starts 17 games this year, Josh Downs is a candidate to easily go for about 85 to 90 catches on the season. I mean, he had over 70 last season, and he's only ascending as a player. So with Downs, I have him as the leading receiver on this team in the receiver group, going for about 75 catches, 750 yards, and 3 touchdowns on the season. And you're going to be like, oh, all these totals are so low for these receivers, but I only have the offense passing for 17 touchdowns on the season. So when you're really dispersing these numbers, you start to realize how even if one of these guys ends up being the top guy in this receiver room, it's still not looking like a great fantasy player with how run heavy this team is and how many targets Tyler Warren could take. So I got Downs finishing, like I said, as a low end receiver 4. And then when you look at AD Mitchell and Alec Pierce, I think these guys both have upside in best ball leagues because they can both catch long touchdowns on a weekly basis, but they're not even worth drafting in redraft leagues. I mean, you're never going to be able to predict when to put them in your lineup. And if we do see in the season Anthony Richardson is the starter, I do like Alec Pierce more. But assuming that Jones is the starter, at least at the beginning of the season, I don't think either of these guys are going to be too relevant, assuming Pittman retakes his role as the clear receiver 1 on the outside. Tyler Warren is the main guy in this receiver room that I do really like. I have him as my tight end 9. He's going as a tight end 13 right now across all drafts. I have him going for about 71 catches for 850 yards and 4 touchdowns. So again, the touchdown mark is really low, but I think the catches and the yards is very high. And I think he's going to be used in a lot of creative ways. He, in my opinion, was one of the best players in the draft, and I'm always willing to bet on talent. If Daniel Jones is starting, I think he's going to be that safety blanket for him over the middle of the field. And considering it's likely that the Colts are going to be playing from behind for a lot of their games, I do really like him because the passing volume is going to be high. I'm not saying it's going to be efficient pass volume, but I think, if they're down 20 points in the game, Tyler Warren's going to be a guy that could come out and just give you an easy 7 to 8 catches on a random week, which you can't say about every other tight end in the NFL. So I have, like I said, Warren going inside my top 10 tight ends, where I think he's just as good of a value as guys like Mark Andrews and Evan Ingram and Travis Kelce. And I would even pay a little bit more to get him over the guys in that next tier, such as fellow rookie Colson Loveland or Tucker Kraft or David Njoku. So I do really like Warren. He's the only guy in this, out of the receiver group that I'd really consider. And then looking at the rushing production for this team, I have the team rushing for about 2,300 yards and 19 touchdowns. So I do think that they're going to be a very productive rush offense, probably top 10 in the league. I have Jonathan Taylor finishing as my RB8, whereas he's being drafted as the RB10. Now, that's not a huge difference, of course, but I do think that people are forgetting how good of a player he was. Just a couple of seasons ago, he was the running back 1 on the season, led the NFL in rushing yards. Last year, towards the end of the season, He proved that he has that huge weekly upside, which is something that you're looking for in not only your redraft leagues, but also your best ball leagues. And so I think if healthy, he could easily lead the league in rush yards again. They're going to be feeding him the ball. I expect him to be getting 20 carries a game. Now, he doesn't get a lot of receptions, but if Daniel Jones is the starter, Taylor benefits the most out of anyone on this team, because now you have at the goal line inside the 5. Daniel Jones could get some rushing touchdowns, but he's not going to be rushing at the same rate that Anthony Richardson would be. So you can uptick Taylor's touchdown potential. And then on top of that, Daniel Jones just more likely to check down as opposed to running like Anthony Richardson. So I think Jonathan Taylor could be the biggest beneficiary of Daniel Jones starting. And since that's the likely scenario right now, that's why I have Jonathan Taylor a little bit higher than others do. And I don't think he's in that elite tier of, Bijan and Saquon and Gibbs, but I think he's easily that tier 2 running back where I would personally take him over guys like Kyron Williams, Breece Hall, Bucky Irving, those types of players going in that range. And then, DJ Giddens, I don't have him projected for anything. He's not worth stashing, but he is a good handcuff where if Jonathan Taylor does go down, this is an offense that likes to use primarily one running back. So he could find himself having a role. So I do like Giddens if you have like a little bit of a deeper bench and you want to stack Jonathan Taylor just to make sure that you get that Colts running back room. I think it's a solid pick, and it's definitely a safe pick. But let's move on now to the strength of schedule. For the quarterbacks, they have the 18th easiest schedule, so they're right in the middle of the pack. Again, we're not talking about really even starting either of these guys, so I don't care as much about this quarterback strength of schedule, but it does kind of show that their schedule shouldn't be too tough because you have, for the receivers, the 6th easiest schedule and the 8th easiest schedule. So they're in the top 8 for both receivers and tight ends, which makes you think that Colts coming off a bad year. Even though they picked pretty high this year, they still got the second best strength of schedule because the Jaguars and the Titans finished worse than them last year. So they play an easier schedule this year, which is going to help for those receivers and tight ends. But I think those guys are just so bad as a receiver room that I'm just still not even willing to buy the dip on them. Whereas for running backs, you have the 28th easiest schedule, also would be the 5th hardest. So it's going to be a tough schedule for Jonathan Taylor, and you have to assume that they're going to be stacking the box a lot this year against him, and he's going to see a lot of 7 to 8 man fronts. But I still believe with his potential to break off any big run for a 70-yard touchdown that you're still going to be starting him every single week. There's never going to be a matchup where, unless you have a really good option on the bench, you're going to be playing him every single week. So I think that it doesn't hurt too much with this strength of schedule. And when you look at their playoff schedule for the fantasy playoffs, you have week 15 in Seattle, which is a good matchup. Their defense is not that great. And then you have week 16 at home against the 49ers, which is not a great matchup, but you play at home, which means they're playing in a dome, which means that Jonathan Taylor and all these receivers don't have to go run in the snow or run in the rain. So I think that's a big advantage with these Colts players, is being able to play in the dome and have perfect conditions as opposed to playing in Buffalo with a foot of snow on the ground. And then week 17, you have the most money matchup possible. They play at home against the Jaguars, who have an atrocious run defense. And I think this is exactly the type of week where Jonathan Taylor, if you make the championship and get to week 17, I think he could be winning people leagues with a potential 30-point performance in that week, because the Jaguars have a terrible run defense. And I think both teams will likely either not be playing for something, or if they are, it's going to be the Jaguars playing for something. So you always look for divisional upsets in those later weeks of the season. But before we cap off this episode, let's just look at some of the miscellaneous, some of those storylines that could change the grasp of the season for this team. Now, we already talked about, Daniel Jones, Anthony Richardson, who's going to be the starter. I think it's also important to look at who's going to be the odd man out between guys like Alec Pierce and A.D. Mitchell. Now, I loved A.D. Mitchell as a prospect. I compared him a lot to T. Higgins, a guy that has good speed, really good hands, great route running for a guy his size. But the problem is, with how low the passing attack is, I just think that it's going to be hard for A.D. Mitchell to really get things going. And because of that, they're going to go with a little bit more of a consistent option in Alec Pierce, who proved last season that he can make some huge plays for them. So I think Alec Pierce is going to be your guy in your redraft leagues or in your best ball leagues that you'd want to take over A.D. Mitchell in this scenario. And then I think the last thing to just look at is, like I said, I predict them to finish last in the division. A lot of people would say the Titans. I'd say those are the two teams that are predicted. But I am worried about this Colts team. I think they could be a team that loses a lot of games early on. And I think the only person that this really could affect is Jonathan Taylor, because if the game script does result very poorly for them, and all of a sudden you have the Colts going down by double digits by the second quarter in every single week, that is going to hurt the rushing volume of him a lot. And then maybe you only see games where he goes for 14 carries for 50 yards and one catch, and he gives you a 7-point week. And that is the potential downside with a player like Jonathan Taylor who doesn't catch passes. So I think that's just something we're going to have to monitor on how competitive is this Colts team really going to be. And they don't have a crazy hard schedule this year. So I think at least in the early parts of the season, they will stay in games. But I do think that this team could be a lot worse than people think and could easily be picking in the top 5 of next year's NFL draft. So it'll be very interesting to see that. But I hope that everybody enjoyed this episode of the Fantasy Brains podcast. Make sure to comment down in the description if you got, or not in the description, in the comment section, what other things you guys would like to see in these episodes. I've mentioned in the past, do you want to see more data from past years? Do you want to see more individual weeks, more comparisons between some players in that range that you could be drafting? Whatever you guys want, we will definitely give it to you. And then make sure to, again, go follow us on all of our social media accounts at Leatherbrains. You can get us on X, on Instagram, on TikTok. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube and hit us with that follow on Spotify. This was episode 9 of the 32 team series featuring the Indianapolis Colts. Make sure to tune in to our next episode, which will be episode 10, covering the Tennessee Titans and the number 1 overall pick, Cam Ward. So I'm excited to get that episode underway next time, and we'll see you there.
3, 2, 1.
Got a blast.
Thanks for checking out the Fantasy Brains. Don't miss next week's episode, Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. See you next week, Brainiacs.